The plate shattered before she heard him. Rosie Callahan had spent 4 months learning the sound of the Frost mansion at night, the tick of the grandfather clock in the east wing, the hum of the wine cellar's cooling system, the particular silence that meant the guards had rotated shifts. She had learned all of it, so she could move through this house like a ghost, unseen, unnoticed, invisible. But she had not learned the sound of him. Nikolai Frost made no sound at all. She only knew he was there because the porcelain plate slipped from her fingers and exploded across the marble, white shards skating in every direction. And when she looked up, mouth already forming the words, "I'm so sorry." Sir, he was already standing at the end of the long hallway, watching her. He wore black. He always wore black. A charcoal shirt, open at the collar, sleeves pushed to the forearm, and in the low amber light of the sconces his face was all sharp planes and shadow, like something carved rather than born. There was a fresh line of white gauze taped along the inside of his left forearm, a thin thread of red seeping through it, and he wore it the way another man might wear a loosened tie, as though it had cost him nothing, as though he had already forgotten it was there. He did not look at the broken plate. He did not look at the mess. He looked at her stomach, and Rosie understood, in one cold, plummeting instant, that the thing she had hidden for 4 months, under aprons and oversized cardigans and carefully chosen postures, the secret she had guarded more desperately than her own life, had just come apart in the space of a heartbeat. She pulled her cardigan closed over the curve of her belly. It was a useless gesture, and they both knew it. "Mr. Frost." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'll clean this up right away." He said nothing. He crossed the hallway toward her, unhurried, his footsteps silent on the marble, and she felt the old animal terror rise in her throat, the terror everyone in this house carried like a second heartbeat. In 6 months, she had learned to read the mansion the way sailors read weather. She had seen the things no one spoke of, the coppery smell that clung to the study some mornings before she could air it out, the pale patch on the Persian runner, where a stain had been scrubbed and finally the rug simply replaced. The night a car came up the drive at 3 a.m., and men carried something heavy and wrapped down to the boathouse, and in the morning no one mentioned it. And Rosie had learned that in this house you cleaned what you were given, and you did not ask what it had been. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could smell cedar and cold air, and, beneath the gauze, the faint iron tang of blood. "How far along?" he said. It was not a question. It never was, with him. Rosie's throat closed. This was the moment. She had rehearsed a dozen versions of it at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of the servants' quarters, and every version ended the same way with her out on the street. No reference, no income, and her mother's oxygen concentrator humming in a room they could no longer afford. "Sir, I can still do all my—" "How far along, Rosie?" He knew her name. She had not been certain he knew her name. 5 months, she whispered. Something moved behind his eyes. Not shock. Nikolai Frost did not do shock. It was quieter and far more frightening, a kind of calculation, a door opening somewhere deep behind that cold grey stare. "Tell me who the father is." And there it was. The demand, flat and absolute, the way he'd demand a ledger or a name from a man kneeling on a warehouse floor. Rosie thought of Damon. Damon with his easy smile and his borrowed cars. Damon who had held her face in his hands and called her his whole world, and then, the night she told him about the baby, had gone to buy cigarettes and never come back, not to the apartment, not to her calls, not to anything. Damon who had taken the last of her savings on his way out the door because he needed to lay low for a while. "Baby, you understand." She thought of all of that, and what she said was, "It doesn't matter. He's gone. It's just me." For a long moment, Nikolai Frost simply looked at her. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the vast house, a guard's radio crackled and went silent. Then he did something she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. He crouched this man, everyone feared. This man who made grown killers lower their eyes. He crouched down amid the broken porcelain, and with the same hand that carried a fresh wound, he began to gather the shards into his palm, carefully, so that none of them would be left where she might step on them. "Go to bed," he said, not looking up. "You'll hurt yourself down here." Rosie did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the servants' wing with her hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift, and she waited for the knock that meant she was being dismissed. The knock never came. What came instead, at 7 the next morning, was Marta, the head housekeeper, 60 and iron-spined and utterly unshockable, standing in her doorway with an expression Rosie had never seen on her before. Something between astonishment and suspicion. "You're to be moved," Marta said. "Moved where?" "Marta, please." Whatever he said, "I can explain." "The Rose Suite. East Wing. Second floor." Marta's voice was carefully flat, the voice of a woman who had learned long ago not to ask questions in this house. "Mr. Frost's orders. You're off the cleaning rotation as of today. There's a doctor coming at 10 to examine you. A car's been arranged to bring your mother's medication weekly." A pause. "He knows about your mother." Rosie sat up slowly. "I never told him about my mother." "No," Marta said, and something flickered behind her eyes, a warning or a wondering. "You didn't. In 11 years, I've never seen him do this for anyone." She hesitated at the door. "Be careful, girl. A man like that doesn't give gifts. He makes investments, and he always expects a return." The Rose Suite was larger than the entire apartment Rosie had grown up in. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the grounds, the manicured hedges, the long gravel drive, the black SUVs parked in a row like sleeping animals. There was a canopied bed with linens so soft they didn't seem real, a fireplace already lit, and on the low table a spread of food that could have fed a family for a week. Fresh fruit, warm bread. A pot of the ginger tea that was the only thing that settled her stomach in the mornings, the tea she had never mentioned to anyone. She stood in the middle of all of it, and felt not gratitude but dread, because things like this did not happen to women like her, not for free, and Marta's words sat in her chest like a stone, an investment, a return. She did not have to wait long to begin learning the shape of him. The first evening, he appeared in the doorway without knocking. She would come to understand that Nikolai Frost did not knock, not because he was rude, but because doors had never been things that stopped him. He stood there in the lamplight and looked at the untouched food. "You haven't eaten." "I'm not very hungry, sir." "That's not for you." His eyes dropped, briefly, to her belly, then away, as though he'd caught himself doing something forbidden. "Eat." And he left. That was all. But the next morning, the ginger tea was there again, and beside it, this time, a small dish of the salted crackers her doctor had recommended for the nausea crackers she had bought once, in secret, with her own money, and eaten alone in her room. She had told no one. She stood there holding the dish and felt the first thread of something she could not name, half comfort, half fear. He was watching. He was always watching. Their second real conversation happened 3 days later, and it was almost nothing, and she thought about it for a week. She was standing at the window with both hands pressed to the side of her belly, because the baby had begun to kick in earnest, great rolling somersaults that stole her breath, and she was so absorbed in it, in that small, private miracle, that she did not hear him come in. When she turned, he was there, motionless, watching her hands on her stomach with an expression she had never seen on him, something raw and unguarded and almost hungry. The look of a man staring through a lit window at a warmth he has been told all his life is not for him. "She's kicking," Rosie said, before she could think better of it. "Do you want to?" She got as far as lifting one hand toward him, and Nikolai Frost, who had walked toward gunfire without changing his pulse, who had stood over kneeling men and decided their lives with a nod, went utterly still. His gaze fixed on her outstretched hand as if it were something dangerous. For one long, aching second, she saw him want it, saw the smallest motion, a shift of weight, the beginning of a step forward. Then he stopped. His jaw hardened. He put his hands behind his back, out of temptation's reach. "The doctor comes at 4, he said, and his voice had gone cold again, the shutters slamming down. "See that you rest before then." He was gone before she lowered her hand. But at 4 the doctor came, and the doctor stayed a full hour, longer than any routine visit required, running every check twice. And when Rosie asked why, the woman only smiled thinly and said, "Mr." Frost was very specific. That was how he spoke to her in those early weeks, never with words. He could not say "I care," but he could not stop his hands, or his orders, or his terrible watchfulness from betraying him. When the November cold snap came, and the old radiators in the East Wing groaned and failed, a specialist arrived by noon to fix the heating in her suite specifically, and Nikolai stood in the doorway with his arms crossed until it was done. When she mentioned to Marta in a conversation, she was certain no one else had heard, that she'd loved a certain series of worn old mystery novels as a girl. 3 of them appeared on her nightstand within the week, out of print, the kind you couldn't buy new. When she woke one night, gasping with a false contraction, a scare that turned out to be nothing, he was there before the doctor was, standing at the foot of her bed in a dark coat with his face grey as ash, and he did not leave until the words, "She's fine. They're both fine," were spoken aloud, and Rosie watched something in his shoulders come unlocked. But he never touched her. That was the strange, aching thing. Once, when she stumbled on the grand staircase, his hand shot out and caught her elbow, and then he snatched it back as though she'd burned him, as though he did not trust himself with the simple weight of her arm. And still, beneath the growing warmth, the fear never fully left her, because she had learned to read this house, and there were nights the study smelled of iron, and mornings he came down to breakfast, moving stiffly, favoring aside, saying nothing. She had chosen not to see it once. She could not unsee it now. She was falling, she could feel herself falling for a man whose gentleness she believed in and whose blood-stained world she could not pretend away. Which was when the other man came back. The call came to the mansion's front gate, of all places, and Marta brought Rosie the message with a face like a closed fist. A man was there, asking for her by name, saying he was family. Rosie knew before she reached the gatehouse. She knew from the particular clench in her gut. And there he was, Damon, thinner than she remembered, in a jacket that had once been expensive, giving the guards his most disarming smile. Rosie, he said her name like a prayer he'd been saving. God, look at you, you're glowing. She said nothing. The guards let her step out to him, close, but not too close, and she folded her arms over the swell of their child. How did you find me? I've been looking for you, baby. His eyes were shining. He could always cry on command. She had forgotten that. For months, I've been out of my mind. I made a mistake, the worst mistake of my life, and I've thought about you every single day. You took my savings. I was scared, Rosie. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, intimate, coaxing the voice that had once undone her completely. I was a coward. I know that now. But you have to understand what I was feeling. A baby, I panicked. You know me. You know I don't handle things like that. You always understood me better than anyone. He reached for her hand. Remember how it was with us. Nobody's ever going to know you the way I do. And there it was, the old machinery, turning smoothly. Not shouting, not threats, just the slow, sweet pressure of a man rewriting the past in real time. You know me. You understood me. It wasn't so bad. Wasn't it partly you? A month ago it might have worked. Rosie could feel the pull of it even now, the awful gravity of a person who has learned exactly which of your memories to press. You panicked, she repeated slowly. You panicked so hard you emptied our account and vanished for 5 months while I sold my grandmother's ring to keep my mother's oxygen on. Rosie, and now you've found me, here, in this particular house. She looked at him, really looked and watched. For the first time in her life, the charms sit on his face like a mask that didn't quite fit. You didn't come back for me, Damon. You'd never have looked twice if you didn't know whose gate this was. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and cold and gone. The real Damon, just for an instant. That's not fair, he said, and now there was the faintest edge under the honey. After everything I do, you have any idea the kind of man you're living with, what he is. I'm trying to protect you. That's my child too, Rosie. Mine. No piece of paper changes blood. His voice dropped, soft as a blade. You really think a man like Nikolai Frost wants you? A maid? He wants a bargaining chip. He'll use you and that baby and throw you both away. And when he does, I'll be the only one who... Stop. Her voice came out low and steady, and it surprised them both. Something had settled in her, hard and clear, in the weeks of quiet meals and secret crackers and a hand that reached and stopped. She knew, now, the difference between a man who takes and a man who guards. I know exactly what he is. I know what this house is. I've cleaned the things you can't imagine out of that study. She stepped back, one hand flat and fierce over her belly. And he has never once made me feel like a thing to be spent. You did that, in one night. You don't get to come back and do it again with a softer voice. Damon's mask cracked all the way through then. The tears dried up, the tenderness curdled, and what was underneath was so ugly, so instantly and totally without love, that Rosie wondered how she had ever mistaken it for anything else. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "You have no idea what you're sitting on top of, Rosie. There are people who would pay a lot to know where Frost keeps something he cares about." The words landed like ice water. She understood, in that moment, exactly what he was and exactly what he was about to do. "Get off this property," she said, "and don't come near my daughter again." She turned and walked back through the gate on her own 2 feet, without being carried, without being rescued, shaking so hard she could barely see but walking, and she did not look back. She did not know that Nikolai had watched the entire thing from the study window on the 2nd floor. She did not know that when she turned Damon away with her own voice, something in that cold, careful man had cracked wide open, that he had stood there with his hand pressed flat to the glass, watching a pregnant housekeeper refuse the man who'd broken her without any protection but her own spine, and understood, finally, past all denial, exactly what he felt, and exactly what he was going to lose if he was not very, very fast. He had Damon found that same week. Not for revenge, Rosie had made her own stand, and he would not take that from her. He had him found for the paper. She learned about it when she pushed open the study doors and saw Damon in a chair, hands zip-tied, a fresh cut over one eyebrow, and Nikolai standing over him with a single document and an expensive pen on the desk between them. "You shouldn't be here," Nikolai said, but there was no anger in it. There was something else, something careful. "What is this?" "He signs away every right to the child." Nikolai did not raise his voice. "He came to your gate to see if you were worth selling. He was right to be afraid of what came after." He slid the pen across the desk. "This is the mercy, Damon. Sign, and walk out breathing, and vanish, because I already know you spoke to the Viduccis, and the only reason your heart is still beating is that she, a slight, precise tilt of his head toward Rosie, asked me once, weeks ago, to never let her child grow up in a house that settled everything with blood." Rosie's breath caught. She had said that, quietly, half to herself, over a dinner she hadn't known he was listening to. Damon looked between them, and his face did the last ugly thing it would ever do in front of her. It sneered. "You really think this ends well for you? Either of you? He's a dead man walking and she's just the—" "Sign," Rosie said. "Or don't. But you're out of my life either way. I already told you that at the gate. I'll tell you as many times as it takes." He signed. His hand shook so badly the signature crawled, but he signed, and the guards took him out, and the SUV carried him down the drive and out of her life for good. And then it was only the 2 of them, and the paper on the desk, and everything neither of them had said. "You watched," Rosie said, "at the gate." "Yes. Why didn't you send men down? Why let me?" "Because you didn't need them." His voice was rough. He was not looking at her, he was looking at his own hands, the hands that had done unspeakable things and could not, still, reach for her. "I have spent my whole life believing that the only way to keep something safe is to cage it, buy it, own it, so completely that no one can take it." He finally raised his eyes, and they were not cold at all. "And then I watched you walk away from that man with nothing but your own 2 feet. And I understood that I don't want to own you, Rosie. I've never wanted that. I want you to choose to stay, and I have no idea how to earn that. It's the only thing I've ever wanted that I don't know how to take." It was the most he had ever said. She stood in the ruined quiet of that terrible room and felt her heart break open. But she was not a girl to be undone by a beautiful confession Damon had taught her the cost of those. "Then you'll have to learn to tell me things, Nikolai," she said softly, "because I won't build a life on a man who protects me and lies to me in the same breath. I already lived that story." His jaw worked, and then, quietly, he nodded, the surrender of a man who had never in his life surrendered anything. "The Viduccis know about you now," he said. It cost him visibly to say it. "Because of Damon. That's the truth, and it's dangerous, and you deserve to hear it plainly." He drew a breath. "I'll keep you safe, but I won't pretend the danger away. Not to you, not anymore." It came at the hospital, 10 days later. She'd gone in for a routine scan, 32 weeks, and glowing, 2 of Nikolai's men trailing at a discreet distance. She was in the parking structure when the black car with no plates came screaming around a concrete pillar. She heard the men shout. She heard the flat, vicious cracks she would only understand later were gunshots. And then one of Nikolai's men had her by the shoulders, shoving her down behind a parked SUV, his body between her and the noise, screaming into his radio, "Contact! Contact! The principal is hit! Principal!" They meant her. She crouched there with her arms wrapped around her belly and the world exploding, and she thought, with strange calm, "I finally learned to stand on my own 2 feet, and I'm going to die in a parking garage doing it." And then, impossibly, he was there. She never learned how Nikolai crossed the city so fast. The gunfire changed direction. A car door slammed, and she heard his voice, and it was not calm, it was not cold, it was raw, and cracked open and screaming her name through the concrete, "Rosie." Then he was rounding the SUV and dropping to his knees in front of her, his hands on her face, her shoulders, her belly, everywhere, checking. "Are you hit? Look at me. Are you hit?" "No," she gasped. "No, the baby's fine. I'm fine." He pulled her against his chest so hard it hurt, and she felt him shaking. Nikolai Frost, shaking. There was blood on his sleeve, not his, and he was murmuring into her hair, over and over, a broken litany. I told you it was dangerous. I told you the truth, and it's still almost never again. Never again." He carried her to the car himself, would let no one else touch her. Carried her full weight through that garage with his men forming a wall around them, and the sirens starting up in the distance. And Rosie clung to his neck and understood that whatever this impossible man felt for her, it was without limit. In the car, speeding through the rain, she found his hand and held it. "The Vaduchis," she said, "not a question." Yes, his jaw was iron. Damon sold them the when and the where. A muscle worked in his cheek. I let him walk out, breathing. "I did that because you asked me to keep our home free of blood. And it almost cost me both of you." He turned to look at her, and for once he hid nothing. The guilt, the terror, the fury turned inward. "I don't regret listening to you. I want you to know that. I would rather be the man you're teaching me to be, and lose everything than go back to being the other one and keep it." She held his hand tighter and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that but the thing she wasn't ready to say yet. He took her to the safe house that night, a fortress on the shore of the lake, reinforced glass and silent guards, the water crashing grey and endless beyond the windows. And that was where, at last, in the dark, everything came apart. She found him on the terrace despite the cold, staring at the storm. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and went to stand beside him, and for a while neither of them spoke. "When I was 6, he said finally, and she went very still, because Nikolai Frost did not speak of before my father caught me, crying over a dog that had died, a stray I'd been feeding. He took me by the back of the neck, and he made me watch while he explained that the dog died because I loved it. Because loving a thing tells the world exactly where to strike you." His hands gripped the railing. He said the only safe love is ownership. You buy it, you cage it, you keep it where no one can reach it. And if you can't own it, you kill the part of yourself that wants it before someone uses it to kill you. Rosie's throat ached. "Nikolai, I built everything I have on that. 30 years. An empire made of ice, because ice can't be taken from you." He turned to look at her, and the mask was fully gone now, and underneath was a man who had spent his whole life being feared and never, not once, being loved. And then a housekeeper drops a plate in my hallway, hiding a baby that isn't even mine, terrified I'll throw her into the street. And I looked at you, and every rule my father carved into me started to crack. His voice broke on the word. I told myself it was about the child. A man like me wanting a family absurd. I told myself it was decency, but it was never decency, Rosie. From the first night it was this. And I have been so afraid of it, because the last time I let myself want something, a man broke it in front of me to teach me a lesson. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb tracing her cheekbone, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to be gentle. I know how to buy and cage and keep. But you won't be kept. You proved that at the gate. You proved it in that garage, and God help me. That's the thing I love most about you. That you'd walk away from any man alive, including me, on your own 2 feet. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "So I'm not going to keep you, Rosie. I'm asking you, stay. Not because I own you, because you choose it. And I'll spend every breath I have left learning how to be a man you'd choose." Rosie was crying now, silent tears on the cold terrace. But she'd been given beautiful words before by a man who meant none of them, and she had promised herself she would never again be moved by anything but the truth. "You didn't lie to me," she whispered, "about the danger, about Damon, about tonight. You told me the truth even when it made you look like a monster and made me look like a fool for staying." She covered his hand with her own. "That's the only thing I needed, not the protection, not the sweet, or the doctors, or the books." A wet laugh escaped her. "The truth. You have no idea how rare that is. Then you'll stay." "I'll choose," she corrected softly, and saw him understand the difference, and saw it land in him like something set finally down after being carried far too long. "And right now, I choose you." He kissed her then, finally, achingly, the kiss of a man who had waited months and lifetimes, one hand cradling her face and the other coming to rest. At last, on the swell of her belly where the child kicked as if in answer. And this time, when the small foot pressed against his palm through her skin, he did not pull away. He pressed back, gently, and made a sound against her mouth that was half a laugh and half a sob, the sound of a boy of 6 finally being allowed to keep the thing he loved. The Verduccis did not stop for a kiss. Men like that never do. But Nikolai Frost was a strategist, and love had not made him softer, it had made him precise. And this time he did not lie to her about any of it. He told her, plainly, over quiet dinners in the safe house, exactly what he was doing, which shipments were vanishing, which allies were reconsidering, which pressure was being applied and where. He asked her, once, what she wanted done about Damon, who had been found in a motel outside Gary, Indiana, having sold her to men who tried to kill her. Rosie thought about it for a long time. "Not blood," she said at last. "I meant that. I want to raise her in a house that doesn't answer everything with blood." A pause. "But he never comes back. Not to this state. Not to her life. Make him understand that in whatever language he understands." Damon Reyes was never seen in Illinois again. He walked out breathing. That was the mercy, and it was hers to give, and she gave it, and Nikolai, watching her decide the fate of the man who'd nearly killed her without becoming cruel, loved her so much he could hardly breathe. The child came on a night of heavy snow, 3 weeks early, in the private wing of a hospital ringed with Nikolai's men. Rosie labored 9 hours, and Nikolai, who had faced down killers without a change in his pulse, spent every one of them white-knuckled and undone, holding her hand, telling her the truth about how terrified he was because she had taught him that the truth was the price of staying. The baby was a girl. She came into the world red-faced and furious and perfect, and when the nurse laid her on Rosie's chest, Nikolai Frost, the cold strategist boss of Chicago, feared from the harbor to the suburbs, sank onto the edge of the bed and wept. "She's not mine," he said, wonderingly, one enormous hand cradling the tiny head. "By blood, she's not mine." Rosie looked up, exhausted and radiant. "Do you want her to be?" He looked at the baby. He looked at the woman who had walked into his frozen life and refused, at every turn, to be owned and had thawed him anyway, precisely because she couldn't be. And for once in his life, Nikolai Frost said the true thing out loud, without a wall around it. "More than I have ever wanted anything," his voice broke, "and I'm not afraid to say it. That's what you gave me. You made it so I'm not afraid to say it." They were married in the spring, in a small church on the outskirts of the city, the snow finally melting, and the first green pushing through the grey. There were black SUVs in the churchyard and armed men at every door, because that was simply the shape of their life, and always would be, and he had never once pretended otherwise, and she had never once asked him to. But inside, in the candlelight, there was only Rosie in a dress the color of cream, and Nikolai in his black with his eyes fixed on her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world, and a baby girl asleep in the arms of an iron-spined old housekeeper named Marta who cried the entire ceremony and would deny it forever. Afterward, in the quiet, Rosie stood with her husband on the church steps and watched the sun set gold over the city that had tried so hard to take everything from her. "Do you know what the strangest part is?" she said. "Tell me." And she noticed, with a small private joy, that he said it now the way a partner says it, not the way a boss demands. That night you found me. When I dropped the plate, she smiled up at him. I was so sure my life was ending. I braced to be thrown out. And instead she shook her head. The most dangerous man in Chicago knelt down in the broken glass so I wouldn't cut my feet. Nikolai drew her back against his chest, wrapped his arms around her and their daughter, and pressed his lips to her hair. I told myself that night I was deciding whether to keep you, he murmured. It took me a long time to understand I had it backwards. He turned her gently until she was looking up at him, and there was no ice left in him anywhere. I wasn't deciding whether to keep you, Rosie. No. I was deciding to be someone worth choosing. A pause, and you're the one who decided the rest. In the golden light, on the steps of the little church, the most dangerous man in Chicago kissed his wife, not a man who had taken what he wanted, but a man who had, for the first time in his life, been chosen and was not afraid, any more, of how much he had to lose. The end.